Okay, so yeah, this is a bit off-piece from my normal videos, but I've been sick laying on the couch all week with COVID and obviously been watching way too much Olympics. And sure, I guess this sort of counts as investing and like investing in people and national prestige or whatever. And technically, the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee is a corporation with financial statements, auditors, sign-offs, everything. So I'm doing it. The first thing I wanted to check out was how all this gets funded, and kindly the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee, the USOPC, gives a nice little breakdown of the funding it provides to athletes via their sports governing body. Money paid by the USOPC comes in 4 different forms. Firstly, money paid directly to athletes in the form of grants, such as stipends for living expenses. Next are services the USOPC pays for athletes, such as the Athlete Career and Education Program ACE. Following that are grants and services provided by the USOPC to the specific sports national governing bodies, the NGBs. Think of wages for non-athlete staff, facilities, equipment, etc. And we are talking about a decent chunk of change here. In 2020, the organization paid out $187 million in funding, which is even more impressive when you consider that the US is one of the few nations in the world where the government doesn't directly fund their Olympic team. That's right, with the exception of a few Paralympic military programs, all funding comes from sponsorship, broadcast deals, donations, and a pretty sweet return on their war chest. What interests me the most, however, is how that funding translates into medals. Looking at the 2020 funding by sport and comparing it to the medals won at the last 2 Olympics completed, the 2018 and 2020 games for the summer and 2014 and 2018 games for the winter. From this it's clear that there's a trend that more money equals more medals. Shocker. However, there are a few things that jump out to me. Firstly, it seems there may be some legacy bureaucracy in how these sports governing bodies are arranged. For example, I'm no expert, but luge seems to have a lot more in common with skeleton than bobsled. And let's be real here, canoeing is just Canadian rowing. I can say that I'm a Canuck. Next up, I'd say some sports really stand out as getting a lot of bang for the buck. Now, the logical medal-minded individual might think, geez, let's just overfund those sports. But it's a bit more complicated than that. For starters, some of these sports include professional athletes that don't really need the money. For example, the US's 3 medals won in golf at the Olympics were won by Matt Kuchar, Xander Schauffele, and Nelly Korda, all pros. Kuchar's Bridgestone and RBC sponsorships dwarf the $64,000 in total USOPC funding, which is probably just enough to cover the fancy outfits. Although if you follow golf, you'd probably expect Kuch to try and expense his airfare. The same holds for baseball, tennis, and basketball, while hockey and soccer stand on the other side of the spectrum. Considered vanity sports, where even though few medals are awarded, they stand out as culturally important to at least give it the old college try. And while it's all fun and games and we hope that everyone has a nice time and learns team spirit or whatever, there are limits to the USOPC's patience. From this 2016 Bloomberg article, it's clear that consistent poor performance almost assuredly is followed by funding cuts. I'm looking at you, rugby. And speaking of rugby, in the run-up to its first inclusion in the 2016 games, the sport saw a steady increase in funding. The USOPC doesn't just fund current sports, but takes a bit of a guess on which sports will be included in the future. For example, squash, bowling, and even water skiing were all considered likely inclusions for future games and started receiving funding. But as the odds of those sports started to fizzle out, so did the money. And while the $190 million or so in annual funding by the USOPC does seem like a lot, we need to keep in mind the number of US Olympians out there. Team USA sent 613 athletes to the 2020 Games in Tokyo, and another 224 to Beijing. Still a decent chunk of change per athlete, but we need to factor in wages for support staff, trainers, facility rentals, equipment, clothing, flights, ugly uniforms, accommodation, etc., and this number quickly drops like a rock. Forbes estimates that 60% of US Olympians take home less than $25,000 per year. Now keep in mind the USOPC isn't the only funding source out there for athletes. A sports national governing body can contribute as well. For example, according to Wired magazine, USA Swimming earns around $100 million annually from registration fees from its 300,000 strong member network, and reportedly pays out around $7 million a year in additional funding to the national team. And athletes do get bonus payments for winning medals, albeit a lot less than more medal-starved nations. And of course, we can't forget about sponsorship. Big names like Usain Bolt have a plethora of patrons. And at his peak, Michael Phelps was taking home around $12 million per year. Damn. But we gotta keep in mind this only applies to a small fraction of athletes, meaning the average Olympian is more likely to have a part-time job than a shoe deal or their face on a Wheaties box. Along with grueling training and injuries, tight funds and inconsistent paydays are common struggles for most Olympians. Hopefully for most of them, the love of the sport and pride at representing their country outweighs all of this. Otherwise, they might be better off just getting a desk job at the USOPC. Looks like they pay pretty well for a non-profit. Anyway, that's my quick look at athlete funding at the Olympics. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please give it a like or consider subscribing for some more informative and hopefully entertaining financial content. This is a new channel, so every little bit helps with the YouTube algorithm. I'm Ryan, and thanks for tuning into Market Lab.